what's up? I'm Adam.
And I'm Patrick.
And we are Guy in a Cube, as well as program managers on the Power BI product team. And today we are going to talk about Azure Synapse Analytics and Power BI. How many people in here are using Azure Synapse Analytics currently? It's about what I expected, so not many. That's okay, so you're here to learn. That's great. How many people are using Power BI? That's what I expected, everybody. That's good. All right. So one of the things that we look at when we think of Synapse and what it tried to accomplish, or what it did accomplish, and what it's evolving into as well, is this idea that when you're working with all of these independent services, you need a PhD to actually get all these things wired up and like, okay, I need access over here, I need all these things. This is a true quote from a chief data officer at one of the larger enterprise customers. He says, I want to be the chief data officer, not the chief integration officer. It's too painful. And so Synapse is working to bring all of that together. And then as things evolve, Power BI and Synapse will just continue to get closer and closer to reduce that pain. And so the other thing we want to impress here is as you're using these items, I know sometimes the data folks are over here and then the Power BI folks are over here and they don't want to talk to each other, they don't want to do things. And the big thing here is leverage the best of both ends together, right? So the combination of things on both sides, feature-wise, will help you to scale your data better with Power BI and Synapse. And so I'll also say, I don't care about the data source in that context either. It's true of anything, right? Just look at the capabilities of both ends to get the best of both worlds. But in this context, we're going to talk about Synapse. All right, Patrick, what is Synapse?
A lot of things.
A lot of things, yes.
Synapse, it's like a complete solution. I think Microsoft calls it a platform on this marketing slide. But it's a complete solution that allows you to build your data estate. Like if you want to extract data from some source, you can use Azure Data Factory or pipelines. If you want to transform the data, you can also use pipelines, but you can use Databricks. You can use Spark built inside of Power BI. And if you want to persist that data somewhere, you actually have a dedicated SQL server that you can spin up. But there's other things that we can do, and we'll talk about those a little later. Right? And so what I like about it, though, is I can reach out to all these disparate data sources, regardless of the source, and use one of those integration tools to pull that data in and land that data in that one simple place.
That's it. Yep. And so think of these as, these are the Legos that Microsoft has. These things existed before Azure Synapse Analytics as well, but now it's just all coming together, like I said, to make it easier,
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the other thing about this is the portal that's available with Azure Synapse Studio. This is where some of the magic is. So it adds all of those components together so you can just, with a few clicks, just get to those items, whether it's the pipelines, whether it's your serverless node, whether it's bringing in your Azure Data Lake storage, and even Power BI in the context of that studio itself. And then from a scale perspective, there are so many options. We'll go through a couple of these in terms of the capabilities on Power BI. When we think about aggregations, we think about hybrid tables, we think about different techniques to reach that scale. I can tell you we work with the world's largest customers, so the big brands that you see every day. And we can tell you that we do have customers using data at scale, like very large data sets, leveraging this technology. All right. Some of the benefits, Patrick.
The biggest benefit that I like to point out often is that they're tightly integrated. Right? It's two Microsoft products working together, and they obviously easily connect, and you can easily consume and visualize data on it. The security is great. It's one-stop shop for all my security. We'll talk about security in a little bit, but I'm going to skip just down to that last one. Right? We get the single source of the truth for everything that we want, and then if people say, "Oh, we need real-time information," you can go DirectQuery. We have all the other features just to extend this and help future-proof your model, like user-defined Aggs, automatic Aggs, hybrid tables, and things like that.
All right, Patrick.
Yeah.
Enough all this talking.
That's my laptop.
Let's head over to your laptop.
Yeah, let's do it. Did you bring it up? Oh,
yeah.
Wow, look at you all fancy.
I'm right there.
All right. There.
Okay. I'm on it.
All right. So when you land, I'm going to back up just a little bit. I want to show you something. So when you go and create your Synapse workspace, you'll land on a page that looks like this, and there's lots of information. We'll talk about some of these things in a little bit. But to get to Synapse Studio, there's a little section right here. If you click open, it'll open up Synapse Studio, and you'll land on a page that looks like this. This is the pane of glass where probably for the last 6 months I've been living my life. Learning about all these different features and capabilities. We did a work day on Wednesday where we just kind of went through all these things. And so on the home page, you can see all the resources.
It's a little small. Can you?
It is. Yeah, I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. And so
I'm getting old.
Mature. You can see here's the recent resources that I've visited. Let me see. I'm gonna do this though. There. What about that?
Yeah.
And so you can see there's some starting places. If you click right here, you have some options to create SQL scripts, KQL scripts. Not going to talk about.
Wait, I have a question. How many people use KQL or Kusto?
Oh, like what is that? So if you
need to learn about that
at 2 o'clock, we're gonna have a session on KQL.
Yes.
So we won't talk about.
Away the secret.
Oh, that's true.
Anyway,
I just really
definitely worth checking that out.
Yeah.
It is a powerful technology.
You can create notebooks. You can even integrate Power BI directly here in the workspace. And so we'll just go down these, the little hubs a little bit. This is where where your data would live, right? And so you can see I have some blob storage, some data lake storage, my integration data sets. If you click on the workspace, you can see there's 2 types of databases. We have slides in there that talk about the 2 types of databases.
Yes.
Okay, and we'll talk about those. There's 2 types of databases. One's a lake database, and then one's just a regular SQL database. But the great thing, the interesting thing about this is when you create that SQL database, it says, hey, do you want a dedicated SQL database or a serverless SQL database? The serverless SQL database, in my opinion, Adam, this is just my opinion, I think it's going to take over the world, right? It's going to change everything because we are, today, whenever you design your data warehouse, if you think about your data warehouse today, what do? You create a fixed schema. You create a table, and relationships, and you insert data into this fixed schema. But if you need to modify it, if you need to change it, what do? Right? How flexible really is that data warehouse? But with this serverless environment, I basically take CSV files, Parquet files, JSON files, I drop them into some type of storage, and I can query those files, as they lay. And I'll show you this in a demo a little later in the session.
All right.
And then develop, you can write SQL scripts, you can create notebooks. How many of you have created notebooks before? I started tinkering with these notebooks, and they're really nice, and they give you the flexibility of writing SQL or Python. And so another big advantage of Synapse is that you get to choose your journey. And so if you want to use a graphical user interface to ingest your data, you can. If you want to write T-SQL, you can. If you know Python, you could use Python. So it's up to you. If you know Spark, use Spark. If you know relational database, use relational database. And then
that's a lot of options.
A lot of options. Sometimes it can be overwhelming.
A little bit.
And then right here, I can monitor the entire environment. I can see when queries were run. I can see when pipelines were activated. I can see when triggers were activated. And then finally, I can manage it all. And this is where you would go create things. And so you can see right here, when you spin up your Synapse workspace, you automatically get this built-in serverless SQL pool. And you can also create dedicated SQL pools. The difference between these two, there's lots of differences, but the primary difference is that the serverless SQL pool is always there, and the only time you're charged for it, the only time you incur costs is when you actually run queries against those files. Where with a dedicated, when you unpause it, because there's a concept of pausing these resources behind the scenes, the compute, when you unpause that compute, then you pay for it. That's the only time you pay for it. But it's got to be up for you to access it, where when you're using dedicated serverless, it doesn't. That's it. That's a quick tour.
So I did notice also your dedicated pool. It looks like it's paused. So you can actually pause those items.
Yeah, because I don't want to get an email from anybody at Microsoft because I left this serverless pool running for all week. So I paused it this morning.
Which we tend to do.
Yeah.
All right. So Patrick, that's great.
Yeah.
But there's also challenges out there.
Lots of challenges.
When we work with things.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of times we've talked about this. There's different skill sets out there. So Synapse is giving you options on what to do. So if you have people in your organization that have those different skill sets, we can leverage that. But then we think about when we've got expensive queries or the different storage modes, slow refreshes. These are all things that can be problematic.
Yeah, yeah.
So what do you do? Right? Go. Right. So on the Synapse side too, we've talked about these items already, right? So we can do T-SQL, we can do Python, warehousing, data lake. There's all these terms, security, and then on the Power BI side, we've got this DAX thing, right? That everyone's experts about in this room. And then we've got our visualizations where people just put pie charts everywhere. But what are the commonalities, Patrick, between these?
Well, we had, when we delivered this workshop, there was a point that someone made about data warehousing and data modeling.
Yeah.
They made a good point, and they're like, well, what's the difference? Isn't that the same skill set? I would say it's not, Adam, because to design a data warehouse, it requires that you understand data integration. It requires you to understand data warehousing concepts like facts and dimensions and slowly changing and incremental loads and things like that. With data modeling, I'm actually only connecting to the data warehouse that's already built, and then I'm just ingesting that data. What I do in the source, what I do in Power BI, or whatever it is that I've imported or connected to, that's a whole different skill set. There may be some similarities, understanding the relationships that need to be created, understanding that I have a fact and a dimension table, but actually knowing how to build them, you don't really need to know how to build them.
All right, so let's talk about serverless versus dedicated.
Yeah.
Patrick, educate me on these two things.
So think of dedicated as your SQL server. Now, it's a bigger thing than that, right? There's 60 nodes behind the scenes. It's a MPP, multi-parallel processing system. And so there's this head node that accepts all the query requests, and then there's the data management services that decides where those queries are going to be sent, which pool is going to be sent to. And you get this predictable performance like your SQL server today. But with serverless, it's completely different. It's a new architecture. It's a new-ish architecture, because if you've been working with SQL Server for a while, you probably heard of Polybase, and Polybase came out a while ago. And this is very similar to Polybase. So think about if I have a storage account, like a data lake storage account, and I start dropping files on that storage account, I can write a query that says select star from this CSV file. And it'll return the results of that CSV file. Should I show that? You want to see that?
Yeah.
Let me show you. Number one. So here's a storage container. When you spin up Azure Synapse, it attaches to a data lake. And so you can either create one when you're creating the Synapse server, or you can use one that's already built. So I have several. Out here, Adam. I got so many of them. And so I'm going to go to my New York taxi. And hopefully the internet is gentle to me. And so I'm going to go to my yellow taxi, and I'm just going to choose a year, right? And if I right click on it, let's go, come on. If I right click, you can see right there it says new SQL script. And so how do you write a SQL script to query a Parquet file? How do you write that SQL script? Well, I don't know, but guess what? This is going to show me. I get to choose my file type. You see there's 3 different file types. There's Parquet, there's text format, and there's Delta. And if you've been here all week, Simon Whiteley, probably you've heard him talk about Parquet files and Delta and stuff like that.
Use Delta.
Delta, all the things. And I'm going to use Parquet. I'm going to click apply. And now what you see is, let's get rid of that, is that it wrote a query for me that uses this open row set function with the path to that CSV Parquet file. Now I can actually put wildcards in here. Like you can see right here, it's specific to a particular year. I can put a wildcard on 2019, an asterisk, and it'll actually query all the folders that's contained within that yellow taxi cab. But if I run this, all I'm doing is querying. It'll take a little bit because I haven't touched this one in a bit. But I queried that CSV file. Parquet file right in a T-SQL statement. So think about if you have these files, a data engineer produces these files for you, and you drop them on storage, I can actually open up tools that connect to SQL and start querying these Parquet files.
It's amazing.
Yep.
All right.
Now you got to be careful though, Adam. You switch back.
Yep.
You got to be careful because if you're using SQL Server, the dedicated pool, if I'm doing DirectQuery, right, I'm not being charged any additional costs, but the fixed cost that is associated with that dedicated pool based on the time I have it when it's not paused. But if I'm using serverless, every time I run a query and it sends that query back to the serverless SQL pool, I have to pay.
Yep.
And so this serverless is not an ideal backend for DirectQuery. It's more, it's meant more for if you want to reach out, cache the data up, and store that data in import mode. And so I forgot his name, but he did a great session on incremental refresh. And you remember his name? Who? Bob? Scott? No. What's your name?
Hey.
Robert French did a great session on incremental refresh. And so combining an import strategy with incremental refresh strategies that Robert talked about is really ideal for a serverless pool.
Yep. And I'm hopeful that as time goes on, serverless will get better.
The performance.
From performance perspective.
Yeah.
Yep. So that'll definitely be on the lookout for that. Okay. So, but with serverless, Patrick, we've got a couple options even there.
Yep.
So this idea of the actual serverless database versus the LakeDB. How do I what is this about?
So how many of you worked with Python or Spark? Very few people, right? It's like, I don't know if I've done anything with this Python or Spark, and maybe I don't want to deal with Python or Spark ever in my life. So you don't have to using Synapse. You can choose. So, but if you create a lake database, Spark is gonna be your best friend because that's actually how you create objects and do most of your work inside of it. But with serverless, it's just T-SQL. Where they are very similar is they both have a very limited T-SQL surface. Like serverless, you only can really read data from it. You can't write store procedures and update and run, those types of data manipulation queries. But you do have the advantage over a lake database because you can do fine-grained security. So I can grant access to an individual's view that I create, an individual external table. Where if I create a lake database, I have to give whoever's consuming this access to every object in that database. So I'm going to show a little Spark, Adam.
Yeah.
Let me show you how you would. Come on. Let's collapse that. I want to collapse that. So I got some notebooks here that I've been trying to pretend like I know how to write Spark. And so you can see right here what I like about it and what I want to show you with this is, so I can create what's called a data frame. And I can read that file in to Spark if I'm doing a lake database. So I can read the file in, any Parquet file, any CSV file, whatever the file is. I read it into this data frame, and then I can create what's called a temp view. And so I remember when I learned about this, I was like, wait a minute, temp view, that's SQL. And I said, I can't believe this is going to be this easy, but this is all the Python that I wrote. And then what happened was, when I started building and creating my objects, look at that. All I do is say %% SQL. I'm still in my notebook, and I can query this data frame using T-SQL. There's some slight using SQL, PySQL. And so there's some slight differences in the language and the syntax. Like, for example, if you look at the bottom,
limit 10.
Instead of saying top, I would need to say limit 10 to return those rows. But you can even go even further with this. You can actually create the objects in your lake database. So I can say drop table, I can create tables, I can write merge statements. I can pretty much do the ETL for my data warehouse directly in Spark, as opposed to writing Azure Data Factory pipelines or writing, what are you looking at?
There's a question. Keep talking.
Instead, I was like, what's over there? Instead of
like a spider coming toward you.
I was worried. Instead of using some type of interface, if you're more familiar with language or prefer to write code, you can do you can do it that way.
All right.
Yeah.
So Patrick, you talked about you keep talking about these notebooks.
Yeah.
These notebooks are amazing.
Yeah.
But like, if it's in the notebook, how do I automate that?
So I learned something this week,
Yeah.
which blew my mind.
It's amazing.
And I knew you could do this, but I learned something.
So real quick before you do that,
Yeah.
understand that when we talk about orchestration and running things, that's where this concept of pipelines comes in. So if you're familiar with something like Azure Data Factory or like SSIS on-prem, that's what's doing that orchestration for you.
Yep.
So continue.
So like I can write this entire notebook with multiple code blocks. There's so many code blocks here where I'm doing things. So let's say I want to extract some data, transform some data, land some data somewhere. So I can create this notebook that has all these code blocks. I can even parameterize this notebook. So if I wanted to pass in values, if I wanted to do dynamic dates, or say make my entire process metadata driven, I can do that. And then right here,
this is bananas.
I can click this little button and it'll automatically add it to a pipeline. And then I can say, schedule this to run. And so that entire notebook, everything in that notebook on some schedule that you specify based on some parameters that you provide can run over and over again. So let's say I have a list of tables that I want to extract out of my blob storage, or I want to extract out from SQL Server or something like that. I can provide that list, then I can loop through that list, run all that code over each one of those tables in this notebook, and that's it. That's my entire ETL process. And it's all metadata driven.
And then even inside that notebook, we could do further orchestration inside the notebook.
Yes, so. Absolutely.
Excellent.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. So there was a question that was submitted. So it says, just to be clear, can we still query a file using dedicated SQL pool?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you still can. You still can query files using dedicated SQL pools. You just, we'll talk about this. We'll talk about what you're going to show next, and it applies to both.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Cool.
Yeah. We'll come back to serverless. I don't want to go to serverless yet. We'll come back to that.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about access.
Yeah.
How do we, when we're working at the database layer,
Yeah.
what do I need to think about? Because I don't want to expose my entire server and everything to just everyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe you do. I don't recommend that.
Yeah.
But we don't. And so how do I control that?
So with dedicated, it's just like SQL Server. All right, you can create Windows accounts. You can create accounts based on Windows authentication, or you can create normal SQL accounts that we've been using for years with lake databases and serverless databases.
Yeah, because I've got these storage accounts. Like, that doesn't translate. I can't use a SQL user at all. I've got to use Windows and then.
Yeah. Yeah. For these, you can create these SQL accounts, but you need to try to give those accounts access to storage, and the authentication for those doesn't recognize those SQL accounts. So if I wanted to, I could use Windows Auth. And I can individually grant people access to the storage. But I don't want people having access to the storage because there may be some other things in that storage that they should not be privy to.
Yeah.
You know, maybe some raw files, maybe some PII that I don't want to give them access to. Man, I could control that at the database layer, but I don't want to give them access to it. So you can walk through these steps. And this is where this question came from. You can give a credential access to the underlying storage, and then create the account, give the account access to that credential, and they can query it. I'll show you this because it's a lot of steps to it. And so this time, look what I did. Your password.
All right. Good job. We're in our workshop on Wednesday, and he puts this up on the screen. I'm like, there's the password.
Yeah, he's the world.
Like, there it is. And then I didn't know it was there. I already had like the zip file for the whole thing, so now I'm going back, and I'm like, I need to scrub that. Oh, bother.
That's good. And so
this is why we don't usually let Patrick out of the cube.
Keep him in the cube. What you could do is, so ignore that first line. I meant to delete that first line. I was testing something out. What you would do is, can you see that? Is that too small?
It's all right.
Okay. What you would do is you would create your login in the master database. And then you create an account based on that login. Simple. This is stuff we've been doing in SQL Server since, I don't know, the beginning of time. But the thing is, now what we need to do is give something access to the storage. And so Synapse, the workspace itself, already has access to the storage. When I provision that Synapse workspace, it automatically gives it access to that underlying storage account. If you add an existing storage account, you got to do a few steps, and it's not that difficult. But then you create this thing called a scope credential referencing that workspace. And then what you would do is create, and this is what you would do with the serverless pool also, the dedicated pool, you create an external data source, and you point it to a file path. right? You can point it to the location where the files are contained, like the container that you place those files in. And then, so I've created 2. And then you can give each individual, and this is only specific for serverless SQL pools and dedicated. You can't do this in lake databases yet. And so you give each one of those, you give the account access to each one of those objects, or you can add it to a role, like a data reader role or something like that, but then it would have access to all of them. And then finally, you give that account references to that credential that you create, and when you create your views, this is what I really wanted to show you. And so, like right now, I'm connected to that serverless endpoint, that serverless SQL using the endpoint that was provided. It's an on-demand endpoint. And if I go into my database, this is a serverless database, and I'm creating views. I've created this logical data warehouse to query these files. And if I right-click here, so let's right-click, and we're just going to script this out. And the last time I did this, I got a red X. So hopefully I don't get it this time. Wonderful, beautiful.
There it is.
And so you can see right here that I'm going to a path. And remember I was saying you can wildcard these things out. So I'm pointing to the location of that external data source. And so you can see right there it says data source equal fact yellow taxi. And so once I say that, if I give that demo user account to that particular object, it can query it without me ever giving anyone access to my underlying storage.
Nice.
It's pretty nice. It's pretty nice. Yeah, yeah.
So there was a question that came in. I'm going to reword it a little bit in the way that I do.
Okay.
So Patrick, we're talking about the portal, right?
Yeah.
It's the one place to go do everything.
Yes.
And you're showing all these things.
Yep.
But can I do this with other tools? So like maybe like VS Code or other items?
Yeah, you can create this stuff wherever you want. So as long as you can connect to that endpoint, that SQL endpoint, you can do whatever you want.
Well, and we're even demoing it right now. We're in Management Studio,
yeah.
Right? So it's a TDS endpoint, and so any of those tools that support that, just put in the server name and go.
So how do you get those though, Adam?
Yeah.
How do you connect to it? So when you create your workspace, it provides those endpoints for you. So you can see there's my dedicated endpoint, there's my serverless SQL endpoint. That serverless SQL endpoint can be used to access both lake databases and the SQL databases. And then we have a development endpoint. So it even exposes it even more.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. One more thing we need to talk about here.
Okay.
And I don't have a slide on it.
Okay.
When we think about Synapse, leveraging Synapse, there's a specific thing in dedicated pools that can help you when we're thinking about large data or big data. This is an item where we usually want to approach things in layers. And so one of the layering options that's available in dedicated pools is this concept of a materialized view.
Oh, we don't have those slides.
Right, I didn't have the slide. Sorry.
That's a great.
So the materialized view is this concept of, basically think of it like a cached result that's on the SQL side, right? So it can improve and speed things up when you're looking at, you're gonna go pull it up.
I am.
Where is it?
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, there it is right there. There you go. So it's this idea of when, and I'm gonna actually take over your machine on that. When you're looking at a given execution plan, you see this item here called shuffle. That is your enemy. You want to get rid of the shuffle, minimize the shuffle. And what's happening is that it's having to move data across different underlying nodes, and that becomes a severe performance bottleneck for you on the Synapse side of things. And so the materialized view will help you reduce the shuffling so you won't have it anymore.
Yeah.
So this is an item where you can create these items. There's also ways that Synapse can actually suggest materialized views for you. But the big caveat I'll put on that is just be careful with how many of these you use. So it could be a little overwhelming, or there could be other items that negatively impact you, but be very intentional with your use of these, but they can absolutely help you scale from a data perspective.
So we're going to talk about Power BI in a bit, but what I want to add to that is, so let's say you're in DirectQuery mode for Power BI, and you open up Performance Analyzer, and you refresh the page, and Power BI will produce a query the query that it sends back to the source. You could take that query and use this function and say, explain with recommendations, and just put that query right under it, and it'll give you a JSON file or XML. It's one of them. I think it's XML. It'll give you an XML document, and then it'll have a section in that XML document, and it recommends the views that you should create. And so then you go create those views, and you don't have to do anything. You don't have to change your model. You don't have to reference those views at all, because the dedicated pool is smart enough. It'll say, hey, you just ran a query. This query references this really big table, but I have a view at an aggregated level that I think that can respond faster. And so it'll just automatically use that materialized view instead of going to that underlying table, and everything should be much more snappy.
The other thing to be aware of too, what's nice about materialized views is if you update data, you get new data, it'll keep that materialized view in sync. So
But that could be a downfall too.
It could be.
Because if you have too many of those materialized views, every time you insert a row, if you have 100 materialized views, it has to insert a row in all those materialized views. Yeah. So you got to be really careful, right?
All right.
Finally, Power BI.
So you mentioned this DirectQuery thing.
Yeah, beautiful. Right. It's beautiful.
So let's look at the Power BI side of this. How many people use DirectQuery? DirectQuery all the things.
No. No. No, DirectQuery is kind of slow sometimes. Sometimes it's kind of slow. But because why, right? DirectQuery, we're moving the storage engine from Power BI, the super fast storage engine, we're moving it to your source. Maybe it's BigQuery, maybe it's SQL, maybe it's Snowflake, whatever it is.
Hopefully it's Synapse.
Hopefully it's Synapse. Hopefully it's Synapse, right? There weren't many hands that went up when we asked who used Synapse, so it's probably not Synapse.
Well, that's why they're here. They want to learn so they can go use it.
Okay, fair enough.
So so generally we recommend, if you can just import the data, import the data.
Yes.
Right? That's going to be your fastest option. I know there's questions about, well, I'm moving data, or I want to keep it at the source. Importing is always going to be the fastest. But if we're working on an approach where we want to have this scale of data and leverage the data source and all that, as we talk about the other options available, start with DirectQuery.
Yep.
Right? So there are different storage modes inside of Power BI. If you start with import, you cannot go back to DirectQuery. But if you start with DirectQuery, you have options at that point to go into a dual situation and or just import.
Yeah.
All right.
So I got a demo.
All right. Of course you do.
Yeah, of course I do, because I hate slides. And so, said that out loud, didn't I?
Yeah. Coming from the person who said, I want all these slides. I'm like, no.
So you can see right now that I'm in DirectQuery mode. And if you go over to the left nav bar, you'll see that there's no data view here. There's no data view because I'm in DirectQuery mode. If I go on the model itself, you'll see that all of my tables, because I have a beautiful little star schema here, all of my tables have this solid blue line. And that lets me know that I'm in DirectQuery mode. And if I hover, oh, come on. Don't do it to me. It's all right. We'll go Control 4. And it's not going to do it.
No, move your mouse off and then back on.
Okay. And if I hover over it, it knows everything about the source. It knows completely everything about it because it knows everything.
Everything.
And so, because what it needs to do is, it says, hey, I'm going to generate this query, and then I'm going to use this information to send that query back to the source and, provide the information for that visual. And so if I go here, this is going to be so fast, Adam. This is going to be so fast. I'm going to switch over, and it's going to run for 3 hours and 42 minutes. And so,
see a lot of Mr. Spinning.
And this works both with serverless and dedicated, or lake databases. And so now I'm just issuing these queries directly against my source, and it was so fast. It was blazing fast. And so you can see if I, slice, do something else, it's constantly sending queries back. And so something that was recently added to help with this is query reduction. And so in the ribbon, so query reduction has been there.
Optimize.
Yeah, optimize. Yeah. And so the query reduction has been there for a long time, but we've made it easier to find because a lot of people had no idea where it was at. And so now if we go here, Adam, you got options.
Yeah.
You want to talk about those options?
So before I talk about the options, one thing I want to call out is from a Power BI perspective, each visual you put on the canvas is going to issue one or more queries to the back end. So you may think like, oh, we had like 3 big visuals there. like I'm only getting 3 queries to my data source. That's not true. So first off, the slicer is a visual too, so that's potentially issuing a query as well. But even like that bar chart, under the hoods, it could be issuing more. I have one example we had where we had this magnificent matrix visual, which is what everyone wants anyway. So that way it just allows them to export it to Excel, which is their end goal for everything. And that actually issued 161 queries for that one visual to the data source. So that could be a lot. And so if you're not the one managing your data source, you may want to become friends with the DBA just to make sure that they don't hate you when you implement this.
And so,
oh my God, the problem's DAX.
Yeah, the problem's DAX. That's why I've opened this, because a lot of times people will look at this and they go, "Whoa, look how long DAX took." I'm like, no.
Fix DAX.
No.
That's higher than DirectQuery.
No, that's not true.
Because if true. That shows more time. I'm looking at it.
It's not true. If you look at this number right here, Adam, if you look at this number and add those numbers up, I messed that up. But if you add all those numbers up, that's a little bit more than 10 seconds right there, right? And so the DAX is so high because it's waiting for that query to finish. It's just waiting.
So really, the way this should look is the direct queries like indented under DAX.
It should be.
That would be more.
Should be. Yeah. It should be. Or maybe just subtract the two and only show that for DAX. I don't know. But anyway, and so you can see, but if I copy this query, what I want to show you is.
Well, wait, I didn't talk about the optimizer.
Oh, you didn't.
So for optimizing when working against DirectQuery, we can edit interactions on specific visuals. So that allows you to, the whole name of the game is query reduction, right? We want to defer execution of certain things. And so from an authoring experience, this optimize will help you in terms of editing interactions on the visuals so they, if you click on one bar chart, is it going to affect the other visuals and vice versa? The other thing that's really cool that was added with the addition of the optimize ribbon, when you're in DirectQuery as an author, especially if you're working on larger sets of data, as you're dragging things on, it starts issuing all those queries. So now you can basically say, hey, pause it, let me do what I need to do, and then run the queries. So that's definitely a great feature that's available for you now. Okay, now you can go.
Okay, and so if I copy this query and go over to Management Studio, just like a word of caution, if you're in DirectQuery mode, and I know when Power BI first came out, everyone complained because there were so many limitations on what Power BI could do with DirectQuery. And so if you look here and you see all those dates, you're like, what is this?
French toast.
What is it? And if you look over here, it's just so many. It's so long.
That looks like a query Patrick would write.
maybe. But what Power BI is doing, I'm using time intelligence. And when DirectQuery and Power BI was first introduced, time intelligence wasn't supported. So many people complained. So Microsoft said, okay, go do it. And this is what they gave us, right? And so be very careful if you're using DirectQuery. And all I'm doing is saying, give me the same sales from last year, same period last year, and it's producing this insanity that you see here.
All right, so we talked about DirectQuery, but we don't want everything in DirectQuery. That's our starting point, right? And so then we can transition into what's referred to as a composite model. And so hopefully all of your data is laid out as a star schema, because Power BI really loves a star schema, and that's what gets us the best performance. And so there's this idea with a composite model where we could have this dual mode storage on a given table. Typically, you're going to want to use that for your dimensions, not your fact table. And what that means is that the dimension table is actually represented as a cached version in the model. And so this is all about Power BI knowing where it can get access to that data. What's really great there, so if we think about a dimension that's in dual mode, that slicer we talked about, we said the slicer is going to issue a query to your data source. But if that dimension's in dual mode, and that's what your slicer is connected to, the slicer is just going to hit the local cache version. And so now we've eliminated a query to the data source, which is great, right? So. Yeah,
so let me show you this. And so what I've done is, I took that direct query. Hang on one second, let me go to this. I'll do the wrong one. So now I have the same direct query model, but what Adam's saying is what you can do with each one of the tables that's not your fact tables, is we can switch to storage mode. And so if I go here, I'm going to go choose this, and I think it's shift. Yep. I can select all my tables. I can multi-select, and then what I can do is expand out properties.
Except the fact table.
Except the fact table. And
don't say all the table.
Okay, yes. And then I can switch from DirectQuery to dual. And dual means now I can operate as either import or DirectQuery, depending on the other tables that I'm connected to. So if I'm in dual mode and I'm connected to a DirectQuery table, I'll be in DirectQuery mode. If I'm in dual mode and I connect to an import table, I'm going to pull everything from the cache. And so if I go, and this came up in the workshop, I'm going to just select one table. And I try to switch this, and this is a really good thing. If I try to switch this, I'm going to get a little prompt. And you get a little prompt, and it says, hey, wait a minute, Patrick. You're not that smart. You're messing up here. Because what you're trying to do...
This dialogue actually was implemented specifically for Patrick.
What you're about to do is switch this table to import, but we're actually connecting to a DirectQuery table, and it's going to create a weak relationship. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Limited, sorry. Oh. But I think this says weak. It does say weak. Oh. Yeah, but it is limited. They changed the name. They did change the name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose a smaller table like calendar, and I'm going to switch it at them. Oh. I'm going to switch it to import. I'm going to ignore the prompt.
Yeah, as you do.
As I do, and I'm going to click OK. And so it's going to start working to pull that data into cache, but I want you to look, Adam. I want you to pay really close attention if it actually does it.
I'm paying attention.
And it doesn't blue screen or anything like that, or an update happens. Man, okay, look at there. It worked. Nice. I'm excited. And so I want you to take a look, just really close, and I want everybody else to take a look and let me know, have you ever seen this in your model before? That little semicircle. Have you ever seen that?
It's like it was drawing the line and then it just gave up and put a space in there.
How many of you have seen those in your model? And what do you do when you see them? Just ignore them.
You ignore them.
You just ignore them. He's like, I just ignore that. I don't care about those, right?
Again, Power BI Desktop just got a little lazy. And
it just got a little lazy. It's not lazy, it's just efficient. And so it just said, hey, if you see that, that means you've run into some trouble. Okay? You're in two different storage modes that really don't work together. You're pulling from two different sources. You're in a many-to-many relationship. There's just some things that Power BI doesn't know to properly generate those queries for you.
Well, in this case, too, if you think about it, the calendar table is imported. So from Power BI Desktop's perspective, all it knows is that it's local.
Yep.
Power BI thinks this table does not exist in the data source where my DirectQuery table is. And so if you do a join of some kind on those two, how does it represent that in the T-SQL query that it's going to send for the DirectQuery table? It has to stuff it into the query, the calendar table, the whole thing.
The whole thing, the entire table. So it materializes its own table and joins to that table. And that's not what you want it to do. And you see how I'm hovering?
Huh? That is not
efficient. And you can see how I'm hovering over this table. It knows about it. But if I go to the calendar table, it doesn't know about the source.
Yep.
So it says, I don't know what to do with this, so I'm going to make my own table in SQL for you. And it can take a really long time for that to work.
So the beautiful thing about composite models also is they enable this capability called aggregations. And this is the peak, right? This is where we want to go. This is the layering approach. I work with a really large customer where we implemented this. They had trillions of rows on the fact table that we were working with. And so we added this layered approach, or like an onion, right? And so the aggregation is this cached, summarized view of the data. So it's at a higher grain. So if all your data is like at a day level, maybe you have an aggregation that's at the year grain or the month grain or some higher form of it. And so in their situation, they had like trillions of rows at the detail side on the SQL server, and then they had a materialized view that was at a higher grain, so maybe that was at the month grain.
Yep.
And then we used an aggregation on the Power BI side at the year grain. And so you got to figure out where are those grains. You need to talk to the business and figure that out, right? What are they looking at so that you know how to create this. But the ag table that was in Power BI was only 255 million rows, right? So it was super small, super fast.
Only 250.
Only 255 million. That's baby data.
Okay.
That's baby data. So again, this also helps reduce the queries, right? So the more queries that are hitting the ag, the less I'm sending to my data source. So you want to try and optimize this in a way that will reduce the number of queries, right? It's all about performance. But what do you do with ad hoc, Patrick?
So before we go any further,
Okay.
any questions? Because we've talked a lot and we're so rude. We didn't ask if anyone had questions. We just blah, 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 blah. Power BI, blah, 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 Synapse. So rude of us early this morning. Okay. All right.
Everyone's experts.
All right.
They get it.
So what was your question now?
Ad hoc.
Ad hoc.
So these Aggs, these are great if I know what the query patterns
Yes,
are.
absolutely.
But what do I do with ad hoc?
You bring in Chat GPT, GTP, whatever that thing is. It'll fix it. No, I'm kidding. So we have this thing called auto Aggs. And so if you use auto Aggs, Power BI will actually go, if you create a model, publish a model out, and it has to be a premium workspace, you can tell it, hey, optimize this for me. You can say, all right, I want all of my queries.
There's a slider bar.
There's a little slider. I want 50.
You want to go to 100%?
No. So first you define your user Aggs.
Yeah.
To cover hopefully a portion of the queries that's going to your model. Then you turn on auto Aggs and you say cover the other 50%. And Power BI is going to keep a log of all the queries that are being sent to the underlying model. And the next time it refreshes, it's going to say, hey, let me look at this. Let me look at the shape of these queries. And I'm going to create some Aggs for you to cover all of these queries. So it's pretty nice. We'll be at the booth this afternoon. Yep. And if you want to talk more about those, just...
So the thing I will say, everything up to aggregations does not require Power BI Premium.
Yeah, that's right.
The auto aggregations capability to learn about your ad hoc query patterns, that does require premium capacity.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah.
Also, we work with a lot of customers and they're like, oh, I need to get a P1, I need to get a P2, I need to get a P3 because my model is getting so big. What you can do with these aggregations is instead of trying to import that very long fact table, you can go DirectQuery and just import the Agg and it significantly shrinks the size of the model. And so you probably don't need to upgrade to a new capacity size or go from pro to premium. We're all about saving your money. That's weird.
Yeah, the sales folks don't like us.
They don't like us at all.
So. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're working with a dedicated pool, excuse me, and I think, Adam, you talked about this already.
This is the layering concept.
Right? And so this works with a dedicated SQL pool because I can add those materialized views that we created, right? And it's usually that 5 to second. They're really good if you have that 5 to 10 second SLA. But then that's when the manual Aggs come in, and I'll show you the final demo where we've implemented some manual Aggs. It's going to be super fast.
You're not going to show that demo.
It's up. I got it going already.
So in that example I mentioned before.
Yeah, I'm going to show it.
In that example I mentioned before, the Agg response time was sub-second. The materialized view was 10 seconds or less. And then the detail table was it was around 15 to 20 seconds response time. So you know when I hit one of those layers, you know what the expectation is on those. And then you can control your report design to accommodate that as well. So, all right. You're going to show it really quick.
Wait, one more slide. One more. I think you don't have it.
Maybe? No, I don't.
Put it in.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me show you. So this is where we created.
2 minutes.
Okay, I got it. And so what we did was, you can see here in the model, maybe you can't. You can see in the model that all my tables are in dual mode. And that's what this little dash line means. You see that little dash line right there? It still knows about the source, but if it's on its own or connecting to other tables that's import, it'll go from the cache. But if it's connected to tables that are in direct query mode, it'll issue direct queries. And so you can see, I also have an aggregation, and all the aggregation is like select this column, select that column, sum this column, and then group by those columns. That's all an aggregation is. And so now when I run this exact same report, I've just added an aggregation, configured the aggregation. I'm going to go ahead and run this. Yes, it's recording. Whew. And boom, just like that. Right? Remember how long it took before, and now if I expand each one of these out, you can see there's no direct query. I don't know where my queries are. Let's do it again. Let's refresh. Let's just show my DAX queries. There we go. And so you can see, right, 12, it's so fast, and I'm not going back to the source. I'm hitting the aggregation. If you come over to the boot, we'll show you how we know it's hitting the aggregation.
All right.
All right.
So we are out of time. And as Patrick mentioned, at the end of the day today, we will both be at the Microsoft booth. So do come by if you want to talk more about this. And thank you for coming on a Saturday morning.